Okay. My name is Øystein Jansen. I'm academic director for the Academia Europea Knowledge Hub in Bergen. But before I say a few words of welcome, just some practical information. Emergency exits follow the green signs over there and over the staircase. Those who are in need to go to the toilets, either go down the stairs to the basement or take the lift to level -1. There are no toilets on this level. Okay. So when this Master's report came out, we thought it was a good occasion to cast some light in Norway on the aspects of science advice for policy. And I'm very happy that we could, from the Academia Europea hub in Bergen, which covers the Nordic countries and the Baltic, be able to co-organize this together with the Norwegian Academy. Very grateful for our collaboration, and I'm sure we can do more of this in the future. This is an important topic. It's important for society. It's important for ordinary people, not only academics. And it's important to ensure that academic knowledge is used and appreciated as a basis for policy, but without academics pertaining to take the role as politicians or replacing the democratic electoral system. But it comes at a very important time. There's a time of lots of confusion. There are different truths. And our democracies depend on our ability to make sense of the scientific information and use the scientific information and place knowledge at our disposal, so that political processes are trusted as a foundation for policy. We are very grateful to the speakers who have come here. Some have come from outside of Norway, and some are from here. We will learn about the European experience with science advisor policy. We'll learn about the Finnish experiences, and also place this into a Norwegian context and where we stand in Norway in terms of systems for this. And lastly, I will thank those who have worked to prepare this event. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Matthias Kaiser, who will guide us through this and also lead the panel discussions. One piece of information: Rebecca Bosch, the State Secretary, has become ill, and it was difficult to find a replacement in such a short notice. So that's a pity, but I'm sure we will have a good day of discussions. So Matthias Kaiser is the former, until this summer, director of the Center for Study of the Sciences and Humanities at the University of Bergen, and has also taken part in the scoping process of this report. So Matthias, please.
Thank you very much, Øystein, and it's nice to see you all here. I shall not take the word too much, because my role is actually, I have the honor of being the moderator. And looking at the schedule ahead of us, I have the impression that I need to be a very strict moderator in keeping the time, because there are more issues to discuss than we probably will find the time to do here. So, and as moderator, it is my pleasure, and I will not introduce specifically all the speakers either. I will just give the names and the institution, and then if the speakers want to say a little bit more, it's up to them, because we have very little time to do this. So I would now, as a start, welcome to the chair here Professor Ole Petersen, who is the director of the Academia Europaea in the Cardiff Knowledge Hub, which is another hub of parallel to Bergen of this European Academy. So, Ole, if you would like to come and take the floor, you'll have about 15 minutes for your... And I will stop you.
Please stop me, yes.
Yes, I will sit here.
Can we make it big?
There we go.
Wonderful.
Yeah, you can use these for...
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Mange tak for invitationen. Det er hyggeligt at være i Oslo igen. Jeg har tilbragt en del af min barndom ikke ret langt væk herfra. So my task this morning is, I guess, to just introduce the so-called SAPER mechanism, Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, and I represent here, as just mentioned, the Academia Europaea Cardiff Hub. Just 2 words about Academia Europaea, the European Academy. Last year, as you can see on the screen, we celebrated 30 years of our existence. Academia Europaea is a classical academy in a sense. It has individual membership. People are elected on the basis of scientific merit. And we have a former president here of the academy, Lars Vallø. It was nice to see him here. And in Lars Vallø's time, the process of establishing various hubs started out. And we have here, as already mentioned, representations from 2 hubs, the Bergen hub and the Cardiff hub. So the Cardiff hub has 3 full-time members of staff, and Louis Edwards is sitting here in the front row and is the hub manager and is really the driving force behind everything that happens in Cardiff. So SAPER, as I said, means Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. It's composed primarily of 5 so-called pan-European organizations, and they are all here on the screen. So Academia Europaea is unique amongst those 5 as being an individual membership academy. The other 4 are kind of federations of number of national academies of various kinds. So we have FEAM, or FEAM, Federation of European Academies of Medicine. We have ESAC, European Academies Science Advisory Council, that's the science academies in Europe. We have EuroCase, this is the Federation of the Engineering Academies in Europe. And we have ALEA, All European Academies, which are a bit overlapping with ESAC, but it encompasses all academies, not only science, but also the humanities. So just 2 words of history. These things all started back in 2015 when the idea came about that it might be useful to generate a science advice mechanism that was much more broad-based than had happened during the period of the Barroso Commission. So the Juncker Commission wanted to do it in a different way, in a more transparent way, in a more bottom-up way. So a number of meetings happened around Europe, and a decisive meeting was in Amsterdam at the Royal Netherlands Academy in February 2016, and that's actually where the name was coined, SAPER, Science Advice for Policy. Things got really going at the end of 2016, and in a formal sense at a meeting in Brussels, together with representatives of the European Commission and of the so-called wise men, the group of chief scientific advisors. The funding came from the Horizon 2020 program, and with that financial backing, the SAPER mechanism started to operate. So just a few words about the general idea. It may seem a slightly complicated mechanism, but it has already proven that it actually works. So as I said, in the Barroso Commission, there was a single chief scientific advisor to Barroso, And while that was a mechanism in a sense based on the UK model, but there were many people in Europe, particularly the green people so in Germany, who were very dissatisfied that the advice was not in the public domain and that nobody actually knew exactly what the chief scientific advisor told Barroso. And that was one of the motives for creating a different kind of mechanism. So it consists of 3 parts. SAPER is just one of these parts. The other one is, I already mentioned, the group of chief scientific advisors, 7 individuals who are appointed by the Commission and who are the ones who directly give the advice to the Commission. And in between is a science advice mechanism unit in Brussels. So it's quite a large administrative unit that kind of mediates the process between SAPER and the group of chief scientific advisors. So the general idea is that somebody in the Commission has a burning question that requires science advice. That then goes to the SAM unit in Brussels that discusses it with the group of chief scientific advisors. And if it is decided that that is a question that the science advice mechanism can deal with, then a request will come to the SAPER mechanism, to the SAPER board, which consists of the 5 presidents of these 5 pan-European organizations that I mentioned. So if they think that SAPER actually can deal with that, then the idea will be that SAPER will produce what we call an evidence review report. And you have all with you a small pamphlet that gives the summary of the evidence review report that will be discussed during today. So the SAPER board will then ask one of the 5 European organizations to be the lead academy, and that academy will then take the initiative to establish a working group of experts, and they will then work during a period of typically 5, 6, 7 months, and will produce what we call the evidence review report. So the idea with that one is not to give very explicit scientific advice as to what the Commission should actually do, but to provide the scientific background to what is actually known at the current stage. It's also quite possible to give options in the evidence review report saying, well, if you did so and so, this would have these consequences, positive, negative. If you did something else, then that could have. But the evidence review is not supposed to be the one that actually gives the very precise scientific advice. The evidence review report will then be transmitted via the SAM unit in Brussels to the group of chief scientific advisors, and they will then produce what we call the scientific opinion. So that is the more specific advice to the Commission. The important point about both the evidence review report and the scientific opinion is that they will be in the public domain. They are published. And that's a very big change from the way the advice mechanism worked in the period of the previous Commission. So they are in the public domain. It does not mean, of course, that the Commission will necessarily do what has been advised, but at least the advice is there. And if the Commission does not want to do what is recommended, then at least they can be challenged in the public domain as to why they did not choose to do this. So that's a basic idea. Usually, we aim to publish the evidence review report and the scientific opinion at the same time. The important point is that the evidence review report is an independent report written by the expert working group that has been appointed by the SAPER mechanism. And the only body that has to approve the evidence review report is actually the SAPER board. So the Commission and the group of chief scientific advisors have no power actually to influence the evidence review report. There is, however, during the period when the evidence review report is being progressed, clear communication between the group of chief scientific advisors and the people who are producing the evidence review report, which is obviously necessary because they have the group of chief scientific advisors have to formulate their advice basically during the period when the experts are working on the evidence review report. So there's a necessity to know what is happening, and they are allowed to participate in the meetings of the working group, but are not actually neither responsible nor directly influencing the writing of the report. So basically, that's sort of the overall idea. There is a scientific advice needed. Reports are produced, these two types of reports that I just mentioned. There will be proposals for policy or potentially even legislation. And the whole idea is that this mechanism should enable better policy making, evidence informed policy making. This, I think, is the word that Jérôme will maybe also use when he reports on the actual master's report. I think the working group felt that maybe it's not necessarily the case always that the policy will be based on the evidence, but at least it should be informed by the evidence. That's sort of, in a way, the least we can demand of our political masters. So just again, very, very quick history. So the very first project that we engaged in SAPER in a big way was the so-called Food from the Oceans. And that was actually Academia Europaea. That was a lead academy for that, as it is for the master's report. And here are the two reports, the evidence review report and the scientific opinion. This report led, in a way, the groundwork for how to do it, and is generally still today regarded as the blueprint for how these things should be done. It was seen as very successful. We also, as we always do quite a bit of what we may call outreach, and this is sort of a popular illustration of what the Food from the Oceans report indicated. The basic idea was that, yes, there is potential for extracting a lot more food from the oceans than is happening at present, but it would be advisable to go a bit further down the food chain rather than just fishing more, and that's somehow illustrated in this type of diagram that was created in a collaboration between the Cardiff unit and scientific advisors. A general idea about SAPER is not only to produce the evidence review report, but also it provides a mechanism for trying to bind together academies all over Europe. So the idea is that these 5 pan-European organizations are, so to speak, representatives of Europe's academic world and can draw also on the enormous amount of expertise that exists in the variety of European national academies, and is actually part of our contract with the Commission that we have a duty to foster this kind of interaction, and an event such as this one today is just one example of the kind of events that should help us in this particular way. There are a lot of opportunities for involvement in SAPER, and some of them are listed here, and many of these are happening. When a working group is being established, we are asking broadly for nominations from all different European academies and science organizations, and indeed we have a representative from many of these in the working groups that we established. So finally, we come to masters. I'm not going to say anything about the report because Jérôme will do that very ably. But again, just to explain the process, it starts usually with a scoping meeting, and we had the first scoping meeting in Brussels quite some time ago. The scoping meeting is quite important, so it's an occasion where a number of experts come together with representatives from the Commission and with representatives of the group of chief scientific advisors, and there you sort of work out what actually are the questions that should be asked and answered, and what to do and what not to do, because very often you need this kind of constrain a little bit the task, otherwise it can become too bad. After that, a working group is established, approved by the SAPER board, and then there are a number of meetings. We actually had 3 working group meetings in the case of masters, which all happened in Berlin, at the Berlin Brandenburg Academy. Of course, the chair of the working group was Ortwin Wren from the Sustainability Institute in Potsdam. And the result is, and you have these reports here, are these 2 reports, and I'm not going to say anything about them. And that brings me actually to the end of my talk, hopefully within the time frame that was given.
Very much so. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.
Ulla, maybe you can take. You will be part of the panel anyway, so you can take your seat here. Thank you very much. If we all keep the time frame like you, then we have hope that we actually can discuss something. Unless there is an immediate short question, I propose we go on with the next speaker immediately, because we will have the occasion to ask questions when we have all the panelists then here, and so you can contribute with that. Another thing I want to say that in principle, particularly this first part here is basically held in English. The second part will be more open, English or Norwegian, whatever you prefer, right? But so we will go on now with the second speaker, and he has already been mentioned. That is my colleague from Bergen, Jeroen van der Sluis, who will introduce this report. Jeroen, please.
Yes, thanks. I was one of the members of the expert group that wrote the report, and I will give some highlights of the report. So the background, as the previous speaker already said, is evidence review. So we had to do an evidence review of the overarching questions, how to provide good science advice to European Commission policymakers based on available evidence on the conditions of scientific complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity. So the report, it was launched in July online and later in hard copy. And then it was used to inform this advice written by the group of scientific advisors. So it was a strict separation in the scope. We did the evidence review and did not give any recommendations, but we highlighted best practices, and then the group of scientific advisors took that further into policy advice. So the timeline here, I think I summarized that already. We had a group of 16 members from a broad spectrum of disciplinary backgrounds and practices from 12 different countries. We had a reasonable female representation in the group, and the report was basically structured in 5 key chapters. So one chapter introducing the concepts and the key notions of science for policy. The next chapter was more looking at what are the prospects, the limitations and the constraints in doing science for policy. The next chapter was more scoping what kind of needs are there, what kind of scientific advice is needed for what kind of purposes, in what kind of context, and all the rest. And then we had a chapter on how we can improve the interface between science and policy, between knowledge and action, and a summary with the main findings. When we interface science and policy, there are a couple of basic challenges that we need to address to bridge the gap between knowledge and action. One issue is that a policymaker needs relevant knowledge, and when you start on a new issue, it's not immediately clear what the relevant knowledge is, so that requires a lot of dialogue. Then we deal with complex problems, but policies need to deal with more tangible problems so that you can handle in a way and bring forward towards solutions. So there is a need to reduce complexity in something that is workable and doable for the practice of policy making. So that's another major gap between the two worlds that need to be bridged. Then there's the problem of time frame. So policy decisions are usually urgent, cannot wait until the science is complete, until all the uncertainties are tackled, if that's possible at all, because we have the paradox of more research, more knowledge, less certainty. There's ever more complexity if we go deeper into the issue, and we know more, but still struggle with uncertainties. And then in the reality of time pressure, we have to inform policy based on the best of our knowledge, knowing that it is in flux and incomplete. Then we have to explore different possibilities. So we also have to work on policy options, not just on evidence, but also see what science can contribute to solutions and balance the pros and cons of these various options and solutions. And then there's the more complex issue that we have to legitimize the decisions, often based on incomplete and uncertain scientific input, in an arena of competing different interest groups. And that brings also a need for robustness and consensus in the assessments, so that it's more widely shared as a legitimate basis for policy making. And we also see this challenge that we have to negotiate credibility with a large number of different social worlds, with different traditions in the sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences, with different practices in the policy, and with different competing interests in society. So the discussions in the group where we did the evidence review focused on a number of issues. Questions like how useful is scientific knowledge for public decision making? What other forms of knowledge can inform decision making and policy? And how do we integrate different forms of knowledge? And this is also needed from democratic point of view. And then should scientific understanding be regarded as universal, or is it, in many cases, is it contingent on context, on all kinds of situational factors that condition the knowledge? And then what status should be given to scientific knowledge in the polarized debates that we face in society? We had a diverse group with many disciplinary backgrounds, and we did not always agree on all the answers. So that means that we also have a plurality of views integrated in this evidence report, as the literature is also plural in this sense. But we had an agreement that we here need to have a broad definition of the concept of science, so not the more English concept of science, but the wider concept like you have in German or in Norwegian Vitenskap, which includes the humanities and the social sciences. And then we see that there was a broad consensus in the group, a shared idea that transformative, transdisciplinary, and co-creative research, working with extended peer communities, as we know from the domain of post-normal science, are together sort of giving the direction towards where to go forward with the nexus between science and society. So there are different concepts that we can use. The report talks about wicked problems, about transdisciplinarity, and another concept is the concept of post-normal science, acknowledging that decisions are urgent, stakes high, values in dispute, and we face irreducible and often unquantifiable uncertainty. And for the problems with these characteristics, we need a new way to interface science and policy. And post-normal science is a critical concept and a source of inspiration for such a new practice. So we acknowledge that the type of science that we use there is more and more based on models, on extrapolations, on assumptions, on all kinds of things that are really hard to validate in the classic natural science way. And we have to deal with problem frames and with value loadings in the indicators that we choose and all the rest. So there is a need for a change of focus towards knowledge quality assessment. So a few elements in this practice of post-normal science. We see that also in the literature on transdisciplinarity and on mixed problems. We need to have better management or better, more explicit dealing with uncertainty, quality, and value loadings in the scientific work. We have to acknowledge that there is a plurality of valid scientific perspectives that can be brought to the debate in informing science for policy. And that requires an extension of the peer community, both internal, in involving more disciplines in the peer review and in the quality control of the work we do, but also external, in involving a wide range of societal actors in how we frame the problems that we address in scientific assessments and also in the quality control. But these actors can also bring in other forms of knowledge, extended facts, that then can lead to better informed decision making. So the evidence review report also acknowledges that science is not one, but that science constitutes many different styles of scientific reasoning. This builds on the work of Ian Hacking, where we see, for instance, examples of styles like postulation or experimental exploration, or hypothetical construction, the idea what I cannot create, I do not understand, as Richard Feynman formulated it, or the ordering of variety by comparison and by typology, as we see in biology, or statistical analysis and probabilities, as we see, for instance, in environmental epidemiology. So this style of reasoning characterizes the way by which different disciplines arrive at scientific propositions, and it also plays a key role in the demarcation between what we see as valid and as invalid evidence. And we see here that there can be different views from different disciplinary traditions and perspectives. And then we have more hybrid styles of reasoning at the interface between science and policy. Then we have to face a number of what we call unrealistic assumptions about scientific evidence, or myths about science that can never be achieved in reality by science, from what we really have to understand if we go deep into the epistemology of how we arrive at knowledge claims. So there is this illusion of certainty. Science cannot always give a certainty, and we have to acknowledge that. And if we keep that illusion alive, then there is an expectation that we can. But in many cases, we can only approximate certainty, but never reach it. Then there is the illusion of transferability, and making policymakers overconfident that if we are quite certain about one particular aspect of a problem, that we have certainty about the whole complexity of the problem. The illusion of absolute truth, making the policymakers overconfident of what, from a scientific point of view, is just a working hypothesis for the time being. And the illusion of ubiquitous applicability, as well as the illusion of the linear model, that the truth entails the good. So we cannot make that connection. There is not a linear relationship between facts and what is the best thing to do, what is good. But it's often perceived as if it's just something you give to the scientist and then they will tell you the best solution. So then we acknowledge that there are different functions of evidence in policy making, and that these different functions require different practices of doing science for policy. And the functions that we highlighted in the report is just a subset of what we find in the literature, but these are the main ones. So it can be enlightenment, so that's more the informing the policy process and explaining the state of scientific knowledge. It can be orientation, like making yourself more familiar with the ins and outs of an emerging risk issue or the implications of a new technology. It can be strategic planning, where it's really helping to make strategies to reach goals that were already decided in the policy process. It can be integration, where we try to make a holistic picture, an integrated assessment of combining information from many different fields to get the total picture, rather than the fragmented one. And then there is the function of co-creation of knowledge to create a more legitimate and robust basis for science for policy. But of course there are also, not listed here, the more instrumental uses of science, where science is used to depoliticize issues by redefining them as belonging to the techno-scientific domain, and then hoping that sort of takes away the more difficult value discussions and decisions. So that is also a practice that we see. If we talk about integration of different types of knowledge in the policy process, then it's important to distinguish between what is known, what is uncertain, and what is unknown, and also what can never be known. We also have to be explicit about that. And then the impact on different aspects of human life must be made clear, of different issues on emerging technologies, for instance. The precautionary principle must be taken into account as we are talking about uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And then this is a central principle in the European domain, and also in the European Treaty of Maastricht and all the rest. And we have to clarify the values that are involved, and it's also important to involve expertise outside academia, including local knowledge, and there is a growing role also for citizen science. So it brings me to some summary, main findings. First, the insights on science advice, summarized here. And we now see that in the time of the Anthropocene, the anticipation of human intervention is more and more a key role for scientists in informing policy decisions. And then the focus should be in the science policy interface on critical review of the evidence and its implications for policy making. It's widely acknowledged now that it should not prescribe policies, but inform policies, as we already heard. So not evidence-based, but evidence-informed. The form of the advice must meet the function of the advice. So I listed some of the functions, and for each function you can have a different form of advice that best fits that particular use of knowledge. Then we have to acknowledge this plurality of perspectives and styles of reasoning and insights. And then we have to be aware of all the pitfalls in doing science, the biases, the overconfidence, the possibility of conflicts of interests, etc. We acknowledge also that science is always affected by values. The composition of the advisory panels and committees is important and should be well considered and balanced. Trust between advisors and policymakers is increasingly important in this time of erosion of trust in science and its institutions. So we have to build trust between advisors, policymakers, and society at large. Analytical rigor and deliberative argumentation is important, as well as involvement of stakeholders and communication. So then for the science advice at the European level, we draw a few lessons from the evidence review. I already mentioned the multidisciplinarity of the composition of the advisory bodies, so that requires continuous attention. The analytic deliberative approach, capacity building is important, high ethical standards and integrity, and codes of conduct that need to be met. And also there need to be operational rules and rights for this in the more legal frames. But there is also a particular need for more knowledge broking and more people who actually can function as the bridge between the two worlds. That is a craft that requires more training, more attention, and more work to better perform that function. And that requires also the building of long-term relationships between scientists and policymakers. So it requires open and robust information flows and new ways of dealing with dissent. And we have seen that the IPCC process has moved the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the first assessment to where we are now, in including more and more of the dissenting voices also in the assessments. So trust in advisory processes is important, and again, the incorporation of citizens. Of course, I can only give some highlights in the 20 minutes, and there are many things in the report that I have not covered, so it's just my flavor of the report. And if another author had stood here, you would have maybe heard slightly other highlights. But one particular take-home insight that I would like to present here is this point that science advice is always affected by values, conventions and preferences. So we cannot escape from that, and we should not do as if we can. So rather than highlighting the role of objective knowledge provider, the science policy nexus is better served when both sides, science and policy, are transparent about the values and the goals that they apply and how the knowledge claims are selected, processed and interpreted. So this is a really important message from the report, that we should stop keeping alive this illusion that science can give ultimate objective knowledge. So that brings me to the conclusions. We see that the world's most pressing problems are also incredibly complex. Climate change, biodiversity loss, insect decline, fisheries, stock management, sustainable aquaculture, all the rest. All these problems are really complex, and scientific knowledge around these areas is uncertain, contested, and plagued by ambiguity, and plagued by this paradox of more knowledge, less certainty. Then we see that science is one of many sources of knowledge that inform policy, but it's a very important one. And science advice can then bring the best available knowledge to the table that can then be used to understand specific problems and to generate and evaluate policy options and to monitor the results of different policy implementations. So there's a key role for science there. Science also provides meaning, sense-making, meaning to the discussion about critical topics in society by giving this enlightenment function and giving a better insight in the ins and outs of what we know. It works best when it's guided by co-creation of knowledge and co-creation of policy options. These have to go hand in hand, so that there's not only an assessment of the problem, but also a first step towards the solutions in the form of policy options. So it means that the relationship between science advisors and policymakers that relies on mutual trust building, and that is something we should keep investing in, and that is also requiring that we are honest about values and goals. And then scientific knowledge should always inform the societal debate and the decision making. And here we also have the emerging role of citizen science that we then here bring also in the last point, in the conclusions. So I hope I was in time with my presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Teron. Can you just sit here? I have the distinct feeling that there are many in the audience who would like to answer or comment right now, but please keep your horses. We have more things coming up, and then we will open up for more discussion. So it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague from University of Bergen, Silvio Funtovic, who, by the way, is also the one of the originators of the post-normal science thing that Teron has just introduced. So, Silvio, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, in the short time I have available, I would like to concentrate and focus in one aspect of the science advice process. And what I can say about this report, that the report is about the rightful place of science in society. And I think one of the main virtues is that it has avoided the temptation of scientism, which is the belief that all human and social problems can be solved by science. Now, in the page, what is it? In page 81 of the report, the main Massos report, you have this diagram, which, as you see, belongs to Jeroen here, and it's based on the work by Jerry Rabbits, a book in 1971, and he describes quite well what is the idea of scientism as a problem-solving strategy. The idea that if you have a practical, societal, political problem, what you have to do is translate it into a technical problem. You solve the technical problem, you have solved the social political problem. Now, let's assume that if the societal political challenge is conceived, is constructed as a symbol, then the idea that you can transform it into a technical problem, solve it, and then that's it, then it has some legitimacy and credibility. But when now more, and you have heard the interventions before, you are more aware about the complexity of the issues at hand. And when I think it is important that what we mean when we say complexity, because complexity sometimes is confused with complication. Really, complication is no more than to add simple problems and solve them together with perhaps some more technical effort. What we mean by complexity is some of the elements that have been highlighted already by Jeroen, is that there is plurality of perspectives about what the problem is. And not only that, that at that time there's a recognition that there are values involved and that there is no simple one-for-all solution for the problem. So just in this short time I have available, I don't want to go into details, but you see, you could assume that you have a one-to-one relation between a practical problem and a technical problem. But when you are dealing with complex problems, you have a relation between one to many. So you can translate a practical complex problem into a plurality of legitimate technical problems. So what you are doing is transferring the political aspect of the main question into the technical arena by saying who decides which is the correct problem to solve. And with more time, we can show examples of this ambiguity. Now, what the problem is, when we take this to the limit, and we are now in times where more and more, with the emergence of automatic algorithmic decision-making, which is totally opaque, the possibilities of a conflict between science, technoscience, and democracy becomes more possible. Because there is an encroachment of the political public sphere by technoscientific solutions. An example of this, an example of this is provided by IBM, what was an IBM president, and the idea of smart. As you can see, the idea that a smart world and smart solution are beautiful, and we should go for them because they are substantially non-ideological. So there is no need for a public or political debate about them because they are essentially technical. Now, the idea that the public political space is more and more occupied by these seemingly purely technical, non-ideological, objective solutions is a problem that will face more and more, creating an increasing conflict between science and democracy. This realization, it goes back quite a while. And I will finish my presentation, and then we can talk later, with where I see an example of anticipation of this type of problem and what are the problems for our democratic system to function and the rightful place of science. Yeah, sorry about this. Okay, this is 1961, and it is President Eisenhower of the United States giving his farewell address to the nation. This speech is remembered because he exposed what it was called the industrial military complex. But the part most relevant for our discussion of today is the last part, where he says, in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could become the captive of a scientific technological elite. So he said it in 1961, and I think the risk is now bigger as before. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Silvio. Again, I'm sure there's many who would like to comment, but again, hold your horses. We have one more presentation, and I would like to invite the president of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, Professor Risto Niminen, to give us his speech about the Finnish experience on science advice.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the invitation and the possibility to tell you a little bit about the ongoing effort in Finland to establish a new way, a new science advice mechanism. My name is Risto Nieminen. I come from the Aalto University in Helsinki. My background is in physics, condensed matter physics. We already heard a very good introduction to what is science advice and what are the sort of general guidelines on developing methods to support public decision, science-inspired, evidence-inspired, evidence-informed, and so on. So I will not go into that discussion. We already heard from Jeroen a very good description about the underlying issues. Instead, I will discuss the project that we started recently in Finland called SOFI. Don't ask me where the acronym is coming from. SOFI is a national initiative focusing on building next generation science advice mechanism. The work is coordinated by the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, and it's also supported by a number of other academies, for example, in engineering sciences. There is the word new science advice mechanism, and that underlines the fact that, of course, we are not starting from scratch. There are several ongoing efforts and mechanisms in place to provide policymakers, decision makers with scientific evidence, scientific background. For example, we have a number of sectoral, what we call sectoral research institutes serving the ministries. They also have a mandate in providing relevant information for that particular field of administration. There are panels in place, for example, a climate panel, a bioethics panel, and so on, which have a more targeted mission in providing scientific-based, evidence-based information to policymakers. And finally, I should say that we have a funding instrument in place, which is called the Strategic Research Council, and it directs substantial amounts of money for strategic research where the themes are chosen and accepted by the government. The cabinet and the Prime Minister's office is active in selecting those themes, which then go to the scientific community via an independent funding organization. Then obviously there are a number of think tanks with different backgrounds, some commercial, some attached to political parties, and so on. We also have a Parliament Information Office, which helps MPs in providing background information and knowledge for whatever members of Parliament ask for. And finally, I should mention that we have a very influential body in place which works more in the policy for science domain. This is called the Technology and Innovation Policy Council, which is chaired by the Prime Minister and has several ministers as members, as well as representatives of the scientific community and the industries. So in one way, there is no need for mechanisms, but perhaps the point is that there are too many, and these various actors all have secondary motives, secondary functions, and for them it may be very difficult to separate lobbying from science advice. So that prompted us to the proposal that the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters made actually a few years ago in establishing a new science advice mechanism, which would in a way represent the voice of the independent scientific community and stay as far as possible away from special interests, lobbying, and of course other invested interests. We also certainly understand that we do not want to become politicians. We want to, in particular, promote dialogue between the political system and the scientific system. So I see this as very much as an effort to change the culture. It's a cultural thing to develop an atmosphere of trust, mutual respect and understanding, and therefore help the society, the decision makers in making better political decisions. So we are very much in this process now. I cannot give you the final answers or the finished solution, how we want to this establish. The SOFI project has started just a few months ago. We were mandated by the previous government last year to start the project, which we did in February. There was a general election in April, and the new government stepped in June, and it has decided to go on with this project, and now we are in the process of carrying out what we have been asked to do and to provide our recommendations for systemic changes, recommendations for establishing a new science advice mechanism by the end of 2021. This briefly shows you the timeline that we are now proceeding. As I said, we started January, February this year by establishing contacts, networks, getting familiar with the present players that I mentioned, and also obtaining benchmark information from many other countries. We have visited several European countries. We have visited New Zealand and Japan and other OECD countries as well, in order to learn from other countries' experiences. We are now entering what we call a trial phase 1, to be more precise. This means that we are piloting a number of case studies with a decision-making system. I should emphasize that what we want to develop is not only a one-way channel for providing answers to questions coming from the political system. We also want to establish the other direction, a two-way dialogue where the scientific community can influence the political agenda, provide foresight, bringing in issues and societal questions which the scientific community sees as important for the future. So this two-way dialogue is very much in our aim. We will be analyzing a number of these projects which are now currently underway. I should mention one of these is an initiative triggered by the scientific community, the academy, is to look into the complex set of questions related to various types of addiction. I mean by addiction here, addiction to gaming, to gambling, to drugs, to alcohol, to whatever you like, which in our opinion, the legislative system could use much more scientific information available. There is a little bit more detail in this approach and timeline. I will not go through this in any detail, but as you say, we are now starting these pilot projects and expect to have much more experience as time goes by, so that late next year, early 2021, we would be perhaps ready to summarize and collect our experiences in order to make the necessary recommendations for the government, which then either chooses to follow our recommendations or not. Here are some examples of our current pilot projects. It's a little bit complicated diagram. I apologize for that. But you see there various types of engagement models. This is engagement between the scientific community and the political system. What we have here on the left-hand side are so-called science panels. This we have proposed to the government to pilot this together. These science panels would be panels appointed by the scientific community along themes that arise from the government's political program. The government has tentatively shown us green light, and we are expecting some of these panels to be appointed. They would be independent of the political system, appointed by the scientific community, and providing evidence-informed advice on themes which are already written into the government political program. Horizon scanning has more to do with this foresight type of function that I mentioned. The addiction is one of these that we are already undertaking, and we have several other possible horizon scanning themes in our plans. Finally, there's a third engagement model that we are also piloting. These scientific red themes is a name for devil's advocates. So this would be scientific panels, projects which would look into the future and paint kind of a doomsday scenarios and trying to flag possible dangers for the future with this kind of a red team thinking. So these engagement models now we have underway. We are piloting them, and most likely there will be more of them, and these all will contribute to developing the concept of scientific advice, science advice, and as I said, the cultural change that we are trying to undertake. And then hopefully within the end of before the end of the decade, we would have also these new structures in place which are based in this cultural change.
How come?
This is another summary of the engagement models. I will not repeat. I already mentioned this. Of course, we have the. It's very important to have this international interface. We already heard from SAPEA and the various academic federations behind it, and we are very much involved in those activities as well. There's no need to reinvent the wheel in Finland if it has already been reinvented somewhere, and that's why the adaptation of the evidence, the advice developed in these mechanisms within the Finnish context is one of our activities. And finally, I would advertise the meeting that we are hosting next week in Helsinki. It's arranged together with the SAPEA project, and it's an opportunity to discuss the future of science advice in Europe in a broader context, not only the SOFI initiative, but everything that we already heard from the Sapea presentation. I'm very happy that this event, which is coupled to the Finnish presidency of EU, has attracted enormous interest. It has already been sold out many times. We are moving to bigger venues, so hopefully, if you are interested, there is still a possibility to attend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very good, and I'm so happy that we have a panel of very disciplined speakers. They all have been keeping the time, and I guess this is maybe the first lesson of science advice to policy. If you want to give advice, be precise and be short. So this is a good example of it. Now, we have until 2 o'clock, and then we will take a little break with coffee or some, I don't know, sweets maybe. But until then, there will be now, it's open for discussion. But I will first ask if any of you want to comment on any of the other speakers. You have the opportunity now. Otherwise, I will turn to the audience and open for questions, comments. Please state your name if you're in the audience, and be short and precise. Don't give a long speech, okay? So any reactions here from you? Jaron and Ul, yeah.
I was just curious about. Yeah, is it working? I was just curious about the red teams. What doom scenarios they have identified so far?
Well, the short answer is none yet. So this is an idea that we came up quite recently, and we have a few preliminary ideas, but perhaps that's right. But the idea is to, as I said, for these scientific red teams to act as devil advocates, examining proposals coming from the government.
Good. Ule, you wanted to?
Yeah, your own mentioned, of course, that one sort of very important principle is the precautionary principle. And I just want to mention the point there, which maybe could be an important discussion point, that of course there's always a tension between the precautionary principle and innovation. And a balancing point is quite critical in these respects, because if the precautionary principle is totally overwhelming, then in fact there may be very, very little innovation, and innovation may indeed go elsewhere. So maybe that is something that is a critical point.
Very good. And that or others may inspire people for... Do I see a hand right there? Yes, please. How is it with microphones? Do we need microphones there? Okay, just...
I have a loud voice.
Okay, good.
I'm Sebastian Watzland, the head of the Center for Philosophy and the Sciences here in Oslo. I have a question about one dimension that you didn't touch on, which is that scientists, I mean, when one uses science policymaking, one tends to use scientists, and scientists tend to come from a particular class of people. I mean, tend to have high education, they tend to be male and come from certain economic backgrounds, at least for many scientists. And I think this is a fact that for scientists is not very evident. It doesn't seem important to them because they are so focused on the science. But I think for lots of people in the general public, this fact is very prominent, and they perceive the use of science for policymaking very much as use of scientists, and that is the use of that particular class of people giving them more influence than they have without the influence of science. And I was wondering what your thoughts were, how to negotiate this difficulty, that it's perceived as biased towards a certain group of people. I know that scientists, because here I see some faces, I mean, I know that scientists don't like to hear that, but I think that is how the general public perceives the influence, and I think it needs to be negotiated.
Yeah. I think there's maybe several people who could answer that. Ule, you start.
Yeah. Well, I think it is an important point you're raising, and I think the only solution to it, which in fact many of us are working on, is obviously on the gender issue, of course. We're trying our best to change this, and in fact change is coming, but maybe not as quickly as it should. And equally for the different socioeconomic groups, I think we have to work towards that. I don't think one should accept that science should be a preserve of a particular economic elite, for sure. At the other hand, I do think it is also very important that one should not dismiss the importance of people who actually have systematic knowledge and are working towards systematic knowledge, because there's a danger if you say, well, you know, one opinion is as good as another one, then you are again coming into a dangerous world. So the scientific world has to move on and has to be able to recruit more broadly than it has, and there are obviously all sorts of limitations there. Not all of those are in the hands of scientists, I have to say, to a large extent. Certainly in, maybe I would imagine and hope actually that here in Scandinavia it is not as big a problem as it is perhaps in the UK and the US, where we have a much more stratified society, because many of the solutions really lie outside science. It is a question of good schooling, availability for all, and a more equal society.
Risto, you wanted to? Yeah.
Yeah, I very much support what Ole just said. I think diversity in the scientific community is one thing, and it's very, very important, and there we certainly have some work to be done. Secondly, I think also it's a matter of building trust in the science machine and the scientific community. I think here in Norway, certainly in Finland, we have a very good starting point in the sense that all polls show that the public at large trusts science and trusts scientists. It's one of the institutions which is held in the highest regard. This is not the case in many other countries, of course, but here we have, in my opinion, we have a very good starting point in building on this trust and strengthening it. And it's of course very clear, as was already mentioned by Jeroen, that decision making is not only about science, and science is the evidence base, perhaps just the bottom layer of in the decision process, where you have then to put the values, the beliefs, and so on, all other boundary conditions which eventually lead to decision making and policy. But you have to have that solid bedrock. In my opinion, one way of putting this idea is that we all believe in democracy, and we accept the political process and the political responsibilities. But what the scientific community should not allow is for the politician to come back later and say, if something went wrong, we didn't know, we didn't have the information. This is the situation that we need to avoid.
Silvio?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think it is important, perhaps in a different way to the way it was answered. The question is important because it makes us aware that when Jeroen presented the synthesis of the report, and we read the report, we see, we are talking, we say, oh, we shouldn't understand science in the traditional English meaning of the word. We are talking about Wissenschaft, Wissenschaft, and things like that, which is knowledge, a more broad sense of knowledge. And then when it comes to the science advice, we are not talking about knowledge advice, but science advice. So we reduce it immediately. We run for cover. So when your question is correct. We are talking about diversity, and then immediately say, oh, gender, or economic power or class. No, we are talking about diversity of knowledges. And if we are beyond the scientific community, the isolated scientific community, the diversity of knowledges are there. And you see those diversity presented in all types of local, experiential, practical knowledges. There, the diversity already exists. So we don't have the mechanism to tap into that, and perhaps because the bureaucratic system of advice systematically excludes those you were hinting at, that they should be present.
Thank you very much. Well, today's program and panels does not reflect a lot of gender diversity. We have to admit that much reflexivity we should admit to. But I have two more speakers here, and just give me a sign. Nils Hansen.
Yeah, I'm a historian and philosopher of science, mainly biology. That's my basis. And there's one thing I'm in a way missing. I think the last speaker, Fedorich, touched on it, and also your question. Namely, it's surprising how much of this report and the discussion here has been about science and technology and the Anglo-American sense of the word. It was said at the beginning that science was here to include the humanities and social sciences. But there is really very little about the humanities. Nothing, I would say. And take, for instance, one very central topic or subject in humanities, history. Obviously, extremely important for enlightening the public, also about scientific questions, whole background. So, I mean, and also the science advice mechanism. It's dangerous with these words, how much they limit our thinking. So, I'm just reporting on impression I get when I read the report and I listen here, that you have forgotten the humanities. And something must be done with that. And it's not so easy, because it's really throughout all of the thinking, it's about science and the possible catastrophes that new scientific knowledge may lead to, etc. So, I mean, this is an obvious challenge, which I hope will be taken up.
Thank you very much. This is another interesting challenge. Have we fallen for the trap of staying too much in the Anglo-Saxon use of the term, Risto?
Thank you for the question. I think it's extremely important. And I hope that certainly it won't be forgotten. The social science, humanities aspects, in my opinion, they are crucial for adaptation and acceptance of whatever advice is forthcoming from the scientific community. How people behave in various circumstances, how they accept decisions. For example, in the case of climate change, I think nowadays it's mainly about the social science and humanities aspects and how do we adapt as humans to the consequences of climate change. So I couldn't agree more, and I think it is important to improve our language so that this aspect of the advice mechanism is also made more explicit. So it's not certainly only about natural sciences, technologies, engineering, and stuff like that. I think this social science, humanities component is becoming important by the day.
Ole, yes. And Jeroen?
Yeah, I take your point in terms of perception. However, maybe you are a little bit unfair, certainly to the SAPER mechanism, because actually we are asking for working group members from all the different academies, including academies that are focused in the humanities. And actually in our working groups we have had representations also from these areas. I mean, the very first report I mentioned on food from the oceans was actually, the working group was in two parts actually. One group was a very scientific one of experts in biology, in marine biology, but the other part was actually a more humanity-based one that also delved into the problems about how we actually can get people to change their behavior in order to enable a more pragmatic and sensible proposal in terms of consumption of food. So we are aware of these things, and I think actually that although the word science is in the science advice mechanism, also given that, for example, ALEA, All European Academies, which has a huge element of humanities in it, is one of the key parts of that. I don't think it is forgotten by any means. And I think actually, although we use the Anglo-Saxon word science, it is actually essentially interpreted in the German sense of Wissenschaft. However, maybe there is a question of a perception problem, and maybe we have to work on that. But it's certainly not forgotten. In terms of history, I agree entirely with you. I'm a very great fan of history and historical research. The fact is, however, that most of the questions we get from the Commission are not necessarily based in that domain, and that maybe to some extent limits the involvement. But it's something that we should look into, I agree.
And just before you want to add something, because I was part of the social science group and the food from the oceans, the expert group from the Zapea report. And yes, there were two groups, but one of the first things we actually agreed on, actually in both groups, is that there shouldn't be two but one group. And we actually decided to interact very quickly, because this separation between the social sciences and the natural science was in the end really more difficult than actually talking to each other. But you wanted to have a short response first?
Yes,
short.
Very short. I think there is a difference between enlightenment, this enlightenment aspect of scholarship and science, and
You
the
don't put this one.
instrumental use. And I noticed that when you talked about involving humanities, you said, how do we convince people to behave differently? Very instrumental.
Okay, but you had a very short one to this particular.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Gunn Birkelund. I'm here to learn, basically. But I just wanted to follow up on this, because you say that the politicians ask questions to the research community, and then you decide whether or not to pick up specific topics and to work on it. And it seems that most of these questions are related to the natural sciences and perhaps medicine, right? So they wouldn't ask questions for the humanities and social science to answer. And that could, well, I don't know, that's why I'm asking. It could be, for instance, that is partly due to the reputation that social sciences may have, at least, that we are sort of riding our own horses, and back to the discussion earlier, right? But could you give any examples? Have you had any questions that is specifically kind of, at least from my field, I'm a sociologist, you could imagine politicians would like to know state of the art on the research on school and neighborhood segregation, for instance.
Well, okay, Ulla first, and then I had Jeroen.
Just very specifically to that question. We do have another element which I didn't talk about because of lack of time. While most of the questions we deal with come from the Commission, it is part of the contract that there can be also an opposite way,
yes,
that the academies can themselves actually propose topics. It does have to get the approval that the Commission is interested in it, because otherwise it won't. So we do have the opportunity there. However, many projects have actually been led by social scientists, including the Master's project, of course, was very dominated actually by social scientists. So I don't think social science may not have been neglected. Maybe other parts of humanities have been, but social sciences, I don't think have been neglected. They have actually been quite dominant in many ways in the Zapea.
Jeroen, you wanted to?
Yeah, I want to follow up on your important question and comment. We had a lot of discussion in the group, actually, on the humanities and the social sciences, and how to better include this in the science advice. And we saw some problems in the existing literature in exactly what you mentioned, the more instrumental use of humanities and social sciences, almost as a lubricating oil for implementing techno-fixes that come then from more science technical elites that come with solutions, and then at that point, the social science and humanities come in as lubricant to implement these changes, and that's not the type of role that we see as best for the humanities and social sciences. So there is something on that in the report as well. So we take a position against this instrumental use.
Can I just, I have you on the list, but would you take another topic, because then I have more reactions from both Dagfinn, Silvio, no? No, okay, not to that one, okay. Dagfinn maybe first then, and can you wait a little bit? Yeah. Okay, good.
Distribution of text, for example, might be more important than the total benefits. So I think that ethics, especially ethics applied in the social sciences, will be a very important factor to never leave out of these reports from the scientists.
Yes. Now, Silvio, and then if there is any other reaction to these issues, otherwise we turn to the next.
Yes, I think this is an important discussion, that a conversation we are having, because if you remember the first diagram that it is in the report in page 81, it say, well, there are very different ways of translating these practical political problem, value problems, social problems into technical ones. And in my view, for example, when you are dealing with the new techno-scientific areas like artificial intelligence, robotics, algorithmic decision-making, history, and other type of humanities are fundamental. But of course, you can immediately say we only need neuroscience and whatever, and just those are not part of the knowledge that it is relevant. So it's precisely how we debate this and deliberate, which is an example what we are doing like that, that not allow that to be reduced as substantially a technical argument.
Yes, thank you very much. Now I have you. Please stand up and.
I'm sociologist. So my question actually relates a little bit still to this discussion that is going on here. And it was about the mechanism of science advice you have presented in the project. I was wondering to what extent, or what is the role of extended peer community in it? Because the mechanism you have shown is that politicians are asking community of researchers some questions, and then researchers are discussing, but then there is this scoping meeting, for example, when you decide what is actually the problem here. And are there any considerations, or were there any considerations to somehow include this extended peer community into a discussion, or in order to actually infuse more diversity into the group? And then there are two other aspects that I wanted to ask about, and it's about two dichotomies that were mentioned here. And dichotomies are, of course, important to make sense out of the world, but I was wondering the dichotomy between politics and science, and thinking about science as independent. So I was wondering if you are able to admit already that it is hard to find a science that would be value-free performance. Could we maybe also agree not to say that science can be independent, or maybe we could say that it could be transparent, because if we ask about money and funding, well, I think it's an important source of issue for discussion. Another dichotomy is dichotomy between knowledge and action. That science is actually knowledge, and politics is action. While if we talk about co-creation, co-production approaches, actually knowledge and action are intertwined into one process of getting knowledge, acting, and then producing knowledge again. And it's not necessarily performed by different actors. I mean here that it's not precisely a situation that researchers produce knowledge and then it is enacted by politicians.
That goes to Ole, Jaron, maybe also. Can I just come with a personal wish, and maybe on behalf of some parts of the audience, that when we use terms like co-creation or co-production of knowledge, that we spell it out. What does that imply concretely, right? Thank you.
Okay, just a few comments to your question. On the practical side, we do have meetings with stakeholders, as we call it, towards the end of the process of producing the evidence review reports. One can always argue about whether all different kinds of stakeholders are involved. And I think the point you make about maybe having a little bit more interaction with what you might call sort of citizen groups could be an interesting thing. Stakeholders has very often maybe been interpreted a bit too limited. So that's the practical point. But the other one, slightly more sort of philosophical one, I do think we need to separate between many different types of problems. I mean, there's a whole spectrum. And I think at one end of the spectrum, and I would just give an example, for example, vaccination against measles, for example, or something like that. There I do think that we could make the point that there is actually a relatively straightforward scientific opinion which is backed by massive quantitative evidence, where we can say that there is a very straightforward scientific advice, and if that is not followed, which is of course to some extent the case now, unfortunately, it actually has resulted in very many unnecessary deaths. So that's sort of at one end of the spectrum where I think there is not too much discussion about these things, and we have to be very careful that we are not diluting things to the extent that we say that scientific evidence can never be absolute and clear-cut. There are cases where it is very, very clear-cut, and where unfortunately now in this sort of era of fake news and when Facebook happy to publish any kind of lie, where we get into a situation where the impression can be gained that, as I said before, any opinion is equally valid. However, most of the questions that come to us from the Commission are entering into quite complex areas where very many different points of view apply, and there I think your opinion certainly is a very valid and important one.
Jaron.
Yes, thanks, Marta, for a nice comment and intervention. This problem with dichotomies is quite universal, because if you reduce complexity into a dichotomy like science policy, you immediately create all the exceptions that come with it, where you have hybrids between the two. I agree with you that a completely independent scientist is one of these illusionary concepts. It's just non-existent. So, because a scientist is at the same time a citizen with a political preference. A scientist is at the same time a stakeholder that is impacted by the decisions made on the scientific advice. And you cannot separate that completely from your scientific advice. So then it's an issue of integrity on how you act with this multiple role of being at the same time scientist, citizen, and stakeholder, and someone with values and political preferences. So then comes the whole issue of being open and transparent about all your value commitments in the science advice. And we say a lot about that in the report and in the conclusions and in the recommendations in terms of best practices. And I think the same holds true for this knowledge action, because there's also a lot of knowledge in action, from knowledge on how to act.
I will just be a little bit provocative and sort of ask your own, what is political about the example of measles?
I was going to talk about that exactly. You see, it seems that we are quite clear about the scientific evidence in favor of vaccination, case of measles and all the rest. But at the same time, we say there's a big movement, and there's a lot of discussions about people opposing it. No, so we have to think, why is it? Why is it? And that is also has to be the subject of our reflection and our advice. And it was the same 40 years ago when we were talking about nuclear power. And this is how risk acceptability field started, precisely. Why people don't accept the opinion of experts that this technology is safe. And so we are repeating the same story with other areas, GMOs, and now perhaps gene drives or gene editing and algorithmic decision making, as I mentioned, and all these things. Why are we, at each stage of innovation, we are asking the same question? Why people don't accept what seems to be rational? We have made the calculations, the evidence is clear, it's quantitative, and most of the, let's put it that way, most of the experts agree, and still you have the problem. So this has to be a matter of reflection.
Have this to do with the trust issue that is also taken up? Well, Ole, you want to respond? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that doesn't actually, that doesn't quite address what I said, actually. So this is the question of how you bring the knowledge into the public domain, which is a matter necessarily not just for the scientist. But that does not dismiss my point that the science in this particular case is clear and is not politically motivated in any way. That there's a problem of combating fake news and lies, that is a quite different thing. But I think the example of measles to me is a very, very clear-cut example of vaccination where you cannot say that the science is politically motivated in any way. The science is clear, straightforward. There is a problem of combating a massive amount of lies and fake news, and that's a different problem. And that obviously cannot be solved by scientists alone.
Okay, but I had now Einstein and then you in the back, yes.
Okay, I have a question mainly for Risto, but perhaps also for Ole. Risto, you explained the system that you have in Finland with science, with advice coming through a chain to the government from governmental labs or expert committees set up by the government, but also think tanks, which is very similar to what we have. So this is maybe introducing things that will come up in the next one, but since you are here. So I was just wondering, and the same goes for Ole, why the Juncker Commission changed from the Barroso Commission in the way they organize this. What were the compelling arguments that made the government decide that, well, we actually need a better system than what we have, and we should discard, at least partly discard, what we are using?
Well, I think discard is too strong a word. I don't think what we have been asked to do, and certainly what we were trying to do, is to come up with a new system which will replace the existing channels of communication, like the sector research institutes and so on. We will complement those. And I believe that the request stems from the fact that the issues that are now reaching the political circles have that amount of complexity that you have to be able to synthesize knowledge over vast domains, and individual sector institutes or individual think tanks have limited possibilities. In addition, as I said, some people perceive that they have a vested interest. They do lobbying for their own branch of activities and so on. So that's why the independent science community, which with no strings attached, if you like. I understand this is a little bit idealistic perhaps, but anyway, that's why they turned to the academy and asked us to come up with a complementary system on top of these existing channels, which has the possibility of synthesizing knowledge, brokering knowledge, presumably independent of other vested interest. Of course, I understand that we are all human beings and we may have our own opinions and affiliations and so on. But I think in this role, we as an academy should put science first and try to be as honest as possible and answering the question, what does science, including social sciences and humanities, tell us about this phenomenon or that phenomenon?
So as far as the European science advice mechanism is concerned, I think in practice the main reason that the Juncker Commission insisted on doing things differently from the Barroso Commission was essentially a pressure from the German Green Party, who made very forcefully the point that scientific advice had to be in the public domain and had to be seen and known about by the general public, which they felt had not been the case if you had a single science advisor whose advice was very often given directly to the government. That's the kind of Anglo-Saxon model that actually still works in the UK, and in the UK it seems to be generally accepted, that one, and there hasn't been a big pushback to that. But in the European domain there was, and the answer to that was this more complex Sapere mechanism, where I think the main advantage of it is that both the evidence and the advice is in the public domain. And personally I think that probably is right in a democratic society. We shall still see, of course, what happens in the life of the new commission that is coming in the van der Leyen Commission. And one thing that has worried many people, including myself, is, of course, that the word science is, of course, missing essentially in the portfolio of all the new commissioners. And that does not seem like a great progress in fact. And of course, the leading article in Nature last week, of course, also expressed worries about science funding even, and you will, of course, be in a central position to also influence that. So we will hope for the best for the new commission. The general feeling about the science advice mechanism is that it most likely will continue, because the directorate that Paquet is running is in favor of it, so most likely it will continue. But that's not 100% certainty at this point in time.
And I'll just add, before Silvia, that in the Anglo-Saxon model, it's basically on one science, based on one science advisor, right, to the government. And then the pressure has been from both sides, from the politics, but also from the other scientists, right? That the science advisor Anglover had opposition even within the sciences, and that creates problems in the public domain, trust and everything, right? So this is, I think, also one has to consider.
I want to continue precisely about that. I was at the Commission all these years that all the discussions about the use of science was being discussed. And even in year 2000, when there was a White Book on Governance, and there was a chapter what's called the democratization of expertise, and it was the creation of what it was called independent agencies. That was a model that was not part of the Commission until then. Is that when the Environmental Agency, the Food Safety Agency, the chemicals in Helsinki, and all the others were created. And the idea was to have an independent political scientific body that advises on certain issues, and it was divided. The problem, in my view, working inside the Commission of other people, was that there was a premise that was flawed. And the premise that was flawed is that you needed independent scientific advice in order to restore public trust. I mean, you will never restore public trust with independent or science input, okay? But that's another matter to discuss. The other point is that when you say the transformation between the model of chief science advice and Glover, in that case in the Barroso Committee, to a mechanism, well, Matthias said it. There was a British pressure at that time to have a chief scientific advice. So you could immediately see how the balance of power shifting shows what type of mechanisms is implemented in the Commission. right? So when you had, then of course the British had their Brexit moment, still have it, and therefore you could then say, well, forget about it. But there was always an uncomfortable relation between the chief scientist and the rest of the European mechanism. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much. I was just waiting for the B word to come up in this meeting as well. Now I have you wanted, right? You had, yes.
I have a two-part hypothesis and a question, but I promise it's brief. The first part is, and this is a hypothesis, tell me if I'm wrong, that the committees are made of very pure scientists, as we used to call them. You know, one of you is a solid-state physicist, is that correct? Number two, I'm hypothesized that most of the questions you get from politicians are on applied subjects. What is the danger associated to consumers with GMO consumption, etc.? Three, my question is, would these committees be more effective if they were populated by scholars that study the application of these technologies? There are lower barriers within those fields, and thus they are more diverse. So tell me if I'm wrong, and then please give me an answer to that question.
Ulla?
In terms of the composition of the working groups, to come to that specific point, they are very often dominated by applied specialists, actually. And so that is actually happening. So if your sort of feeling is that they are totally dominated by what you might call pure scientists, then that's actually not the case. I mean, there are a lot of applied specialists coming into each of these working groups, but of course always depending on the on the topic. It's true that the academies, where of course is the origin of the Sapir mechanism, the academies do tend to be dominated by kind of classical science. That's undoubtedly the case, and that's still the case for most national academies that I know in Europe. But the working groups are not confined to having members who are members of the academy. In fact, in many of the working groups, we have had even a majority of people who were not actually members of the academy. So we can actually go quite widely. We take nominations from all sorts of different bodies, and judgments are made about what will actually be the most useful grouping in terms of actual knowledge of the topic that is involved. It is true that most of the topics that come up from the Commission are indeed relating to applied areas, and that also reflects the composition of the working groups.
Silvio?
Yes, I think it's, yes, let me complement that answer, which is also in my experience. If you are talking about expert groups inside the Commission, okay, it's different from the mechanism. And in the expert groups, so if there is a problem that is, there's a perception that there is a technical or scientific input to be had, then expert groups is organized. There is a very structured way, it's called comitology in the language of the Commission, is that how those expert groups are run, and more importantly, what questions can be asked and what questions can you not ask. For example, you can ask questions about risks. You can not ask questions about who benefits. Or do we need that? So those are questions that in the committee are not allowed. So therefore, because of the way questions are, which questions are allowed, which questions are not allowed, then how you select your experts.
Okay. I don't have any more from the audience here on the list. I would like to put a question to you, and that it goes back a little bit to the question that Dag Finn-Føllesdal was raising earlier about the normativity issues. I mean, public policy can sometimes be dominated with questions that are deeply relating to value questions, to value diversity in a society. I'm thinking about food and, let's say, animal welfare, or, you know, I mean, should we, you know, meat eating and these things. Now, these, let's say, I'm not talking about questions that have to do with the food safety, which is a typical, traditional, scientific in a broad sense question. But can these questions, could they be made part of a SAPEA advice, or is that something where the SAPEA would say that is not our concern, go to the churches or go somewhere else?
No, I think values do come in actually when we go back to the food from the oceans project, for example. I mean, there were discussions there which were sort of philosophical in the sense that there are certain marine biologists, of course, who have the belief that the oceans should be left as a wilderness. Whereas there's another group of marine biologists who think that it can't be treated as a garden where we arrange things in such a way that there are certain benefits that arise from that. So that's an example of kind of fundamental belief, actually, which cannot be discussed in a scientific way. I mean, there's sometimes you believe in this or you believe in that. And that certainly can influence opinions, of course. But even there, of course, there are, again, a separation in terms of whether we should eat meat or not. Of course, there are technical issues even there in terms of sustainability in the globe and so on, and scientists have a valid opinions there. That this, again, can be influenced, of course, by other values is very clear. And I think there's no reason as such why the SAPEA mechanism cannot deal with that. And particularly, as I say, we do have the bottom-up approach as well. So what Sylvia said is perhaps to some extent not totally valid for the SAPEA mechanism. The SAPEA mechanism has a significant element of independence from the Commission. It's true that the topics have to be agreed there, but as soon as the working group is established, then, as I repeatedly say every time we start a new working group to the working group can do whatever it wants to do. And the only body that has to approve the report is the SAPEA board, not the Commission. So the Commission obviously has very strong influence on the scientific advice that finally is coming from the group of chief scientific advisors. But SAPEA is, in that sense, independent.
Okay, and that would actually provide also a little bit of a bridge to the second part of our program, that is after the break, because in the second part of the program we will be now looking at Norway and basically asking ourselves, do we need something like that? Is there really a need for a better science advice in Norway? Could we learn from what you have told us? And one of the things that you just told us, that there was there is an institutional division between the policy making bodies and those that have to deal with the evidence, the scientific knowledge that is there, and that these are decoupled. We will maybe, hopefully, discuss this in the second part. Until then, I would say thank you so much to this panel. And I believe there's coffee and something there, so we'll meet in 15 minutes again.